Indeed. We're looking forward to amazing and very fruitful discussions in the next 4 days of Webit Global Impact Week. Thank you so much, Commissioner Reinders, for your keynote and mentioning challenging and very fruitful discussions. There is a discussion panel coming up next on the topic of technology and innovation in the public sector. And I have the pleasure to welcome a long-standing friend of Webit, creative diversity lead and journalist at BBC, Nina Goswami. Nina, please welcome the panel. Thank you.
Welcome to this fireside chat on technology innovation in the public sector. I'm Nina Goswami, the BBC's creative diversity lead, a journalist, and also your moderator for this session, which is part of Webit's Global Impact Week. I'm joined by 3 fantastic panelists. We're going to delve into what the public sector can have, what impact it can have when it comes to technology innovation. And instead of me reading their biographies, I'm going to get them to introduce themselves. I always think it's a bit more fun that way. So let me turn first to you, Jeanne Holm. You are the Chief Data Officer and Deputy Mayor for the City of Los Angeles. Tell us more about yourself.
Sure, thank you so much. And it's great to see everybody today. So my name is Jeanne Holm, Deputy Mayor for Budget and Innovation in Los Angeles. And I oversee the city's $11.5 billion budget, as well as a variety of services and technologies, data, innovation, personnel, general services, a whole variety of things. You'll hear about some of the exciting programs as we talk about through our discussion. Before I came to the city, of which I am a 3rd-generation Angelino, I worked for the World Bank in Sub-Saharan Africa, helping develop open data systems with the White House under President Obama as the open data evangelist for the US government, and 30 years at NASA doing technology systems. So really happy to be here today.
A really long, brilliant history there, which is definitely going to be fruitful for this conversation. So thank you, Jeanne, for joining us. And now to Laura Sallstrom, a Professor of Technology Policy at Duke University. Tell us all about yourself.
Thank you. Such enthusiasm. I appreciate that. Yes, I am a professor of technology and trade policy at Duke University in their Sanford School of Public Policy. I have spent the last 30 years of my career working on technology and trade policy related issues. As you might imagine, technology policy was something quite different 30 years ago. There were a lot of discussions of facts, which we don't talk about at all anymore, and things like Y2K. I did spend some time with the US Trade Representative and then in the Asia Pacific region working for the Business Software Alliance. And I have developed and sold to consultancies now.
Great, so we can draw on quite a wide range of experience from you there. So thank you, Laura. And last but not least, Ott Velsberg, who's the Chief Data Officer for the Estonian government. Tell us all about yourself.
Yes, thank you. Glad to be back here. So I'm currently serving as Government Chief Data Officer for Estonian government, and I oversee the strategic coordination of data governance, open data as well, artificial intelligence, and basically enlarge everything that has to do with data in Estonia. And as part of the work, we have much time to talk about it, but we are right now introducing government virtual assistant, for instance. And at the same time, I'm currently a PhD student at informatics at Uppsala and Umeå University.
Gosh, so you haven't got enough on your plate already, by the sounds of it, just for a PhD in there as well. Fantastic. Oh, well, welcome to you all, and also to everyone who's joining us for this specific session. When it comes to public sector innovation, the BBC, where is my home when it comes to work, we are a public sector service broadcaster, and I have the real privilege of heading up 50/50, the Equality Project. And at the heart of our project is data. And what we do is we use data to diversify the voices in the media, to increase representation on TV, radio, and online. And that public sector innovation is not only just being used at the BBC. We went from one news programme in the heart of the BBC London newsroom to now 700 teams across the BBC. It's not only being used there, it's also being used outside the BBC in more than 120 organisations, which I think is quite pertinent to this particular conversation when we're looking at public sector and the impact it can have on innovation. So those 120 organisations using those 50/50 core principles to increase representation in their particular sectors and give underrepresented voices a voice. So my big first question to the three of you is around that idea. You know, when we think about tech innovation as, you know, Joe Bloggs on the street, we're thinking about Silicon Valley as a place to create innovation. And that's really the private sector that we're thinking about there. So can the public sector drive change in innovation? Jeanne, I'll come to you first. And if so, how?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the example you gave of the work you've been doing with the Equality Project is a perfect example. You don't do this alone, but you do it in partnership with others. Shared values, templates help to be able to let people replicate. And that is actually a perfect example of how government is really an inside driver of innovation. So we're one of the largest spenders on technology and one of the largest employers generally in our region. And that ability to spend money towards new innovation, towards new capabilities, towards government services is really the ability to kind of drive the market. I mean, we just have to kind of think about the fact that our procurement processes that we don't normally think about, and it's in partnership together. So it's together, not alone. But the idea that we're really trying to make sure that we're working on this innovation, building on the things that come out of innovative and tech companies, new ideas from student groups, and others is really how we work towards a future. But if we think of innovation only coming from Silicon Valley, we lose that equity discussion. There are a lot of stories out of Silicon Valley about failures, either internal to workforce or the delivery of products and services that really aren't equitable and in fact push away a whole sector of society. So we want to make sure that government partnerships with private sector, with academia, are really focused on social good and not just profit. And there's some great examples of this in Los Angeles, even something like autonomous vehicles and electric vehicles. So one thing is that tends to be skewed towards people with more income, but we wanted to make sure that it was accessible and socialized with people of all income levels. And so we put in Blue LA, which is electric vehicles that can be rented for just $2 an hour. And so it's a really convenient way of people to get around, but also to socialize that. And that's exactly where we're starting with autonomous drone delivery and autonomous vehicles, is making sure that we have innovation that's created in an equitable way that really drives private sector forward in a direction that looks at equity and data security.
Thank you, Jeanne. I hope your throat's okay on that for the rest of the discussion. Well done for carrying on. Thank you. Laura, kind of coming back to you, I mean, picking up on a couple of things that Jeanne was talking about there as well, collaboration, you know, public sector driving forward innovation through collaboration. Is that something that you're seeing? And have you got other thoughts around that too?
Well, I'm glad Jeanne went first, because I would have said, no, government can't be innovative. I not heard her comment there, but she makes an important point when she says partnership, I think, and also government's role in regulating, in the sense that they're presenting a framework that is beneficial to society at large. I don't think that the government, at least at the federal level, is itself nimble enough to be innovative in the sense that they are creating technology themselves. But I think that governments have become very adept at spending, especially on basic research and development. I also think we're beginning to see a substantial shift in the way the US government behaves with respect to innovation and funding, where it is almost moving to a place where it is adopting an industrial policy approach to new technologies and AI in an effort to maintain a competitive edge globally. And that the size of funding that you're talking about and the level of government involvement you're talking about is something that is new. And it does model China and European models. So it'll be interesting to see if our government is capable of turning that into something effective.
A good feed into Ott and getting your opinions, a European perspective maybe, coming from Estonia, and thinking about that kind of funding model. Actually, I think that's really interesting to see that shift and influence through that. Ott, what's your experience been so far?
Yes, so great question. And I can first of all say that it really depends on the government. So we can see that in the USA and in some other countries, the approach is different. In some areas, the focus is more on private sector. In others, for instance, in UK, it is more directed towards universities. At the same time, in Estonia, definitely the public sector is a leader in innovation as well. And we can see that the kind of the digitalization level in private sector and especially in manufacturing is a lot lower than in government itself. So right now, if talking about the Estonian experience, then the level of digitalization is basically 99%. So almost every service is possible through digital means. And at the same time, this brings us to kind of the kind of hires our expectations on how the government should function. So now we are kind of going towards making the government more proactive, more seamless, even less bureaucratic than it is right now. And even in our AI strategy that I put together a few years ago, we saw that the public sector itself must lead the field itself. And we have to have kind of a forerunner approach, and the things that we develop in the public sector can be then adopted by the private sector itself. So perhaps a little bit disagreeing with Laura in a good sense that there is a difference, and the public sector truly has a role. But of course, everything that we do in collaboration with universities, we do in collaboration with private sector. And the same model has allowed, at least from our end, we have for our small nation, 1.3 million people, we have right now 5 unicorns and counting. So this has enabled us to be more nimble, more digital advanced. So definitely there is a kind of a role that governments can fill, and especially related to innovation itself.
I can see that Laura is kind of chomping at the bits to come back in and react to that, which is fantastic. If you are watching and listening to this session, which is part of Webit's Global Impact Week, you can get involved using the hashtag Webit. And so, Laura, go on then. What was your response going to be to it there?
No, I think they're all valid. I think they're all valid points, and I do think that there are nuanced roles here. I do become concerned when I guess we'll talk about this at some point, in the dependency and the interdependency that is developing, right? So there's an innovative capacity. There's a history to date of letting the technology sector just go largely unregulated. And we are, and that's had huge benefits to society, right? But now we're at an interesting place where innovation has perhaps gotten out of control, or technology's gotten out of control, and there's not the government function of regulating it, and there's a huge government dependency on it. So yes, partnerships are important to innovation. Letting the private sector go in innovation is hugely important, and there is a role for government to play in innovating, in the sense that it is regulating or driving technology to a positive area, I think.
It actually kind of brings me on to something that I wanted to bring Jeanne in on, like kind of considering what we're discussing here and that impact that, we have seen in terms of private sector innovation on society. I mean, Jeanne, how do you see the relationship between government and the private sector as it stands at the moment? Is it a healthy one?
I think it kind of varies. And I really resonate with what Laura said, is unregulated innovation, which sounds odd to actually say that phrase, but unregulated innovation can have consequences that may not be fair for society and may leave people out of the equation. So let me just give an example around 5G. So we try to be an extraordinarily business-friendly city for our telecommunication providers. There's 4 million people in Los Angeles, scattered over 500 square miles, a whole variety of complex geographies. There's extraordinary wealth and poverty in the same city. And the digital divide is something that we are actively and have been actively working on for many years. So the more people the telecommunication companies get connected to the internet, the more people, the better it is for Los Angeles. But in doing that, we have regulation. So what we've done is we'd had long talks with their telecommunication companies, understood what their needs were, which was time and money, and then made sure they understood what our needs, which was getting built out into every community and equitable and affordable access to the internet, along with digital literacy programs and computer labs in neighborhoods and schools. And we created a telecommunications and digital equity forum, and every single telecom provider, I still can't believe this, in Los Angeles comes to that monthly meeting. We have open and very honest conversations. We help them to expedite permits, but we regulate the placement of those 5G small cells and antennas so that it doesn't interfere with the quality of life in neighborhoods. So we don't want a large antenna going into a poor neighborhood on the only green space they have. We don't want 5G small cells in places where the community feels uncomfortable with that for a variety of reasons. And we also want to make sure we don't put high level new power poles and antennas in communities that have a historic look, because we do a lot of filming in Los Angeles. Los Angeles is home to Hollywood. And so we want to make sure that we keep historical aspects to certain areas. But what that does is it lets us have discussions very clearly and honestly about net neutrality, about equitable access, about affordability. We've had a huge contribution from T-Mobile, for example, of 18,000 5-year Wi-Fi hotspots for our foster care and homeless kids during the pandemic. We've had contributions from Starry Internet that put in free high-speed broadband into our public housing for 16,000 families. And this is just like, so while we're doing innovation around the digital inclusion, we're doing it in a way which the regulations and the governance bring us towards a more equitable solution.
Okay, it sounds like some fantastic work going on in LA. And I wonder, is that replicating over in Estonia?
Yeah, so I wanted to just add that perhaps it is important to think in terms of, I think Europe at large is a great place to see that regulation itself doesn't kill innovation. And Estonia is one of the examples. Of course, it can make it more difficult, but we need to consider why we actually regulate things in Europe. It is in order to increase trust in how companies operate, in how governments operate. And through trust, we can actually ensure that citizens use the technology, use the services that we in the end provide. So we have had kind of our fair share of different crises as well, for instance, related to electronic ID. In Estonia, everyone has a kind of digital identity. And we have had problems, but regardless of any of those circumstances, we don't see any drop in the level of services people use that the government provides. You, of course, have the analog version, but the digital uptake, how people use digital channels, keeps going higher and higher, regardless of the crisis that we have had before or in the future. And this is only because people can trust how the government functions. The government is transparent. And similarly, we have hopes that the private sector operates in a similar model. This is unfortunately not the case in some countries. And for instance, let's take US. Unfortunately, today, it is impossible for European governments to use public cloud services that are offered by US companies. That is due to regulative differences that we have. So, of course, there are differences, but the regulations are there typically for a reason.
So it's that kind of check balance idea, isn't it? That we're all kind of aiming towards there, I think. And also that it creates some form of stumbling block as well if we're not singing from the same hymn sheet, which is an interesting thought, and something that obviously as technology innovation becomes even more deep-seated in everything that we do, is going to become, and the world becomes smaller as a result, is something perhaps policy needs to be really at the heart of. Laura, what's your thoughts around that?
Oh gosh. I think we're coming to an interesting place in the United States and globally, where the U.S. government is beginning, the federal government has realized, although with quite a diversity of opinion, that there is need for regulation here. I'm not sure that they've quite sunk into the level of dependency that exists in this relationship. And, if you think about it, the government relies on the technology sector for its national security, for its economic security, for access to law enforcement data. And you're having to then regulate a group of companies that also are motivated by profit. Most of them are SEC listed. So, they're required by law to make a profit and return to shareholders. So the idea of regulating them is challenging when the regulator is dependent on them. And there are a hugely varied sense of national identities and priorities globally around things like privacy and national security and who you feel comfortable with and who you don't feel comfortable with. The best world for the technology sector would be one where you had universal regulation or common regulation for things like cross-border data flows or privacy. I think it's unlikely that that is going to develop. So because we are so different and because we want to maintain those cultural differences, I think you're naturally going to end up with bifurcation or multiplication. But we do need to begin to regulate in the US at the federal level on things like privacy and competition and start to be a little more creative about SEC requirements, I think. In addition, the US government should start to do some things to lessen dependency entirely on companies and make this more of a partnership. There have been some proposals recently by the National Security Council that was appointed to look at AI that recommended, for example, the development of a digital core in the US and the establishment of a federal university to build technology expertise, which I think is also interesting.
We're going to come back to artificial intelligence, AI, a bit later on. I just want to give Jeanne and Ott both an opportunity just to maybe come back a little bit in terms of kind of when you look at public sector and what regulation looks like now, and is it going to be possible in the future to have something a bit more universal? Jeanne, what do you think?
I think that there are pieces that can be universal and there's some pieces that need to be localized. So the idea of, preserving historic neighborhoods in Los Angeles is probably unique to a few cities, but it's the idea of what it means for your sort of cultural view of your city is important. So if we do things too broadly, it becomes difficult. But at the same time, I think that I'm also going back to something that Ott said about trust in government. So you want to have that transparency, be able to have open conversations about the policy. I'm on a team with the White House right now where we're discussing environmental justice. And so this kind of connects to a lot of the things we've been talking about, which is how do we display and share data about environmental issues, air quality, green spaces, and that sort of thing, while still doing it in a way that's understandable and making sure that we regulate policies across the country that don't inhibit innovation, but make sure that everything is safe and equitable for our citizens. And I think that it's really important that we, from a local government perspective, I'm always thinking about the equitable provision of services and the quality of life of our residents and the support for our businesses. So while we want to be business friendly, we want to do that in a way that never compromises the ability of our citizens to have a good quality of life, nor compromises the ability of us to protect their data. They have a huge amount of trust when they share that data with us, whether it's getting a dog license or paying a parking ticket or their water and power bill. And we want to make sure that that data is secure. And as we think about like overarching policies, which I totally agree with Laura, we need to kind of do more, and this will change as new technologies come out. I think we'll see new policies around Bitcoin soon as well. AI has been around for a while, and yet now we're just talking about the national regulation and policies around that. And so I think it's an always evolving game with us. And I love the fact that academia helps to inform government, which gets driven many times by private sector. And at the end, we hope that we're finding something better for society.
And what do you think? Something better for society, universal regulation. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, it really depends on whether we are talking about restrictive or supportive regulation. So there has to be a fine line, really. And in some instances, let's take GDPR, that's definitely more kind of universal rights and restrictive regulation in many terms. And we have seen that in terms of our AI adoption or implementation as well. It puts additional burden, but it is for common good. And then you have supportive regulation that enables new markets or new business solutions, regulates across border, for instance, free flow of data, and especially talking about open data. So there are definitely fields that we should have a common way of approaching. There is definitely kind of local characteristics, even when it comes to, for instance, in Europe, there is a Data Governance Act. So it regulates consent-based data sharing, but locally, each government still adopts it a little bit differently. And similarly with open data, we have the kind of the universal basis. We have standards that we need to follow for data interoperability, but at the same time, how it's enforced within different governments in different countries, it is different. People have different expectations on what is actually considered open data. For us, business registry information concerning companies, that is really kind of not considered open data at all. But let's go Sweden, across the sea, and you have a lot different approach. What should be provided available to everyone. You can see how much person gets salaries, where they live, and so on. But this is unimaginable in many other countries. So there are, of course, kind of cultural differences, but we need to move towards more integrative way of approaching things, because otherwise we get market segmentation. And in Europe, this is impossible to see, and globally as well.
Yeah. So it probably comes back to Jeanne's point of it's being very developing, very evolving in terms of where we see this policy moving forward. Just to take a moment to remind everyone that we are having a fireside chat here about technology innovation in the public sector as part of Webit's Global Impact Week. And do get involved with #Webit. Right, so we've been talking so far about public versus private innovation, what good policy could look like. There's a lot of tension at play. I'm interested in delving a bit more into two certain areas. One definitely around security, because tech is all pervading in all our lives, even if we don't even realize it, there is something happening in the background. So Laura, coming to you, thinking from a policy perspective, do you think that, there is kind of cybersecurity policy is strong enough right now for what society needs today and also for the public sector?
I don't know that it's strong enough, but it goes to I don't think policy is strong enough necessarily, but I'm not sure that in this case it's the fault of policymakers so much as it is the innovativeness of the bad guys out there and how quickly all of this changes. They are super talented in all of their forms. I do think that the relationship between governments and cybersecurity companies is probably one of the healthier ones. There is a lot of communication that happens. There's a lot of mechanisms for reporting information to the government. So in that sense, I think it's strong and policy is on track, but cybersecurity is a critical issue for national security, for infrastructure. And again, there is still this dependency. There's very little rules globally on the issue, which means enforcing against hackers or the bad guys that are based in another country becomes nearly impossible. I do think that we're going to have to find a way to completely rethink how we think about this, not just at a national and federal government level, but also how we begin to educate individuals to start to empower them at a very basic kind of citizen level to think more about their cybersecurity.
Do you think that's quite much a solution then, Laura, is about the individual opposed to just looking at it from the global?
Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you. Jeanne, the comments that you're hearing, the ideas coming from Laura, how does that play for LA?
Very much so. But I think one of the things when we think about cybersecurity, we're thinking about, intrusions and attacks when we also have to think about the vulnerability. So every good physical security system has layers of security, right? So you have fences, you might have a ring system at your house, you might have a dog that barks. These are all different layers of security so that if there's a failure at one, there's backup systems. In the same way that we look at our cybersecurity, the weakest link is not necessarily our ability to protect against penetration efforts, but the ability to protect against social engineering efforts. So the clicking on that link in the email, answering a phone call from somebody who's desperately needing information, but you don't actually know that that's that person. Those are the places that we find that there's vulnerabilities. And so we do a lot at the city, and I know a lot of others do, around sort of, we phish ourselves, right? So we send out emails, you have an Amazon gift card. But the goal is that if somebody clicks on one of those phishing links, then they get taken back to the cybersecurity training and they have to do it again. So the idea is to reinforce vigilance at every level. And Laura said something intriguing about making sure we do this with younger people. So there's a national program in the US called Cyber Patriots. And what that does, the program's been in existence for a long time, and it teaches kids as young as third grade how to be cyber aware and safe online. And so we start with certain programs and training them, like, how to make sure that you're working with other children, how to, be aware when there's somebody who's maybe not keeping your interests in mind. By the time they're in high school, they're doing red team, blue team competitions and trying to actually do attacks into each other's systems. So it's LA and our North Hollywood team has won for several years in a row. We're very proud of them. But what it does is it helps people from the youngest age have that as part of their DNA. And I just think that's so important. Because again, residents and businesses trust us with their information in order to do transactions with the city. We want to protect that. And we also want to make sure that they're informed. So we have an LA Cyber Lab that we work with about 500 of our local businesses, a lot of which are small businesses. Maybe they're not really big on cybersecurity and aware of it. And we train them on what are the critical things they need to do. And we give them monthly updates on these are the things we're seeing in the Los Angeles area with cyber attacks on businesses. And so they become aware, they become informed, they become more secure themselves, because weakness in any place for these kinds of attacks is weakness for the whole community. And we all rely on each other. And so we all want to help each other.
Yeah. Gosh, there's, again, loads of innovation going on just in terms of how we're educating citizens there from Jeanne. Thank you. When we're looking at it kind of government perspective, are you trying to catch the bad guys, or is it still looking at the individual and trying to ensure that they understand what's happening there?
Yeah,
just
to follow up, it's actually both sides. So from one side, you need to improve kind of citizens and also companies' experience, but at the same time, the other side is collaboration with other countries. And as part of kind of digitalization that has happened in the government itself, and it is taking place in private sector as well, then Estonia has so far, we have consistently raised cyber issues on international stage. And just to kind of bring out the kind of the federal or government level collaboration, then for instance, in Estonia, there is not a NATO Cooperative Cyber Defense Center for Excellence, and similarly, European Union Agency for large scale IT systems. So in many ways, it is really about collaboration on both local with private sector in countries themselves and also on a global level. The cybersecurity threat today raises basically every month. We see more attacks, and it is together with our great allies and friends that we are able to stand by. And this inherently means also that we need to raise kind of the basic cyber and data hygiene among the larger population, starting from kids, ending up with elderly people and everyone else in between.
Right, lots of thoughts there about what's happening right now when it comes to cybersecurity. If you have any thoughts, please get in touch, #Webit. But let's now look to the future and what do we need to do as a public sector, as governments, to ensure that technology innovation is working for society and those that we serve. Jeanne, coming back to you, we mentioned AI earlier on. Does that have a role to play here?
It absolutely does. And I think there's a few things about artificial intelligence that are both exciting and terrifying. So, we take small steps into AI where we're, as somebody mentioned chat earlier. So, chat bots and those sorts of things and kind of provisioning 24-hour services. We're doing an amazing project with NASA right now, a large NASA grant around predicting what we breathe using artificial intelligence and machine learning to combine satellite data and our ground data in ways that help us to predict air quality in the future, including the randomness of wildfires, which is really helpful to folks and generally is really trusted. But artificial intelligence can also have another aspect, because behind it, of course, we're creating algorithms. We're training against a data set. We're creating an ability to improve on or speed up human intelligence in making these decisions. And in doing that, there's a risk of implicit bias. So, for example, I have animals, but I love dogs more than cats. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's just a bias I have. So if I'm looking at something for animal services, I may code something or create something or train an artificial intelligence agent that has a slight preference for dogs. And in doing that, when we then extrapolate it out more broadly, and we're thinking about our universal basic income program, which we're just launching, which is the largest in the country, to provide 3,000 families $1,000 a month for a year to help them lift out of poverty. When we think about that, the way in which we're looking at how we select families for that, how we make sure that we're, asking people questions that help to assure their eligibility for the program. Those questions have to be worded, and that data has to be normalized, and the information has to be gathered in such a way to get rid of that implicit bias and to make it as fair as possible for everybody. And part of the way we do that is just bringing more diverse voices into the conversation. So back to your project with the Equality Project, the more diverse voices we have in media, the more representative the conversation is. And that's the same way that we look at our artificial intelligence and machine learning programs, is we want to bring lots of young and old, different voices, different ethnicities into the conversation, because they help to shake out those implicit biases.
Yeah, and actually, the implicit bias is one of the things that I always think about when I think about AI. Remember one of those adverts where you have the soap dispenser where it's supposed to, you put your hand under it and then it lets the soap out, but actually only if you have lighter color skin. If you're darkest color, it doesn't recognize you. Laura, I'll bring you in on that, and because one of the things with my diversity hat on is that I do think about the diversity of workforce, and what do you think the impact of that is at the moment for the tech industry, and where does it need to go?
Well, absolutely. I love that question, and also Jeanne's point about bringing in a more diverse group of people. Absolutely, that's the case with data sets and with algorithms. But I think your question is to the challenge here, which is we've been talking about diversity in the tech sector for about 10 years now. It's had some focus. There's been a little bit of progress in increasing the number of women and minorities, but it's still really small. I had to do a project recently where I was pulling out some of this data to actually look at how many advances there have been. And there's some increasing enrollments in STEM classes at basic levels for girls. There's not, but there's still not that many women choosing these courses in college or seeing them actually take jobs, or certainly not senior roles in these areas. So that brings you back to, okay, well, yes, we may have more transparency in data sets. Yes, we may have more ability to review algorithms, but who's reviewing them? Because we don't have a big diversity of individuals trained in those technical skills. I think some of that is being handled by AI experts by simply bringing in different kinds of people who may not have those skill sets. But the fundamental problem here is still that you don't have enough individuals who represent that diverse community trained in the technical skills to be able to do the reviews or to participate in the processes.
And this is one of the big things, isn't it, with machine learning and AI, is that if you're not putting in the information in the first place, because you're not thinking about that as something that's going to impact people, then it's not going to necessarily feed into the machine and create the AI, which is reflective of society in the first place.
Or even if you offer me the ability to look at the algorithm, I'll say, okay, I'm not a technical person. I can't review that algorithm.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. And it brings me out to the idea around kind of the data that we're collecting. You know, one of the big concerns, I think, from individuals and citizens is very much about personal data being misused. You know, what kind of position do we find ourselves when we think from a government perspective to bring that kind of check and balance to make sure that we're getting the right benefit and risks balance for AI and technology innovation as a whole?
Mm-hmm. So first of all, I'm just going to address the first question as well, that there's a lot of discussions about bias, but bias is often inherited through human decision making. And we often have kind of really high standards when we talk about the machine learning. So in short, what we consider today to be AI. And I'm always really cautious about just outright banning different use cases. We need to look at the facts, how different systems operate and their success factors. So for instance, in Estonia, we use an unemployment agency to provide recommendations on people on how to increase their employability. If the success of a human agent recommendation is 58%, so a person is 6 months afterwards still at that recommended job, and using AI, that success rate is 80%, then do we really need to outright ban something if the overall success rate is that much higher compared to based on kind of a gut feeling? So I'm always a little bit cautious, but it brings back to the discussion we had before about the transparency. So in Estonia, we are utilizing data tracker. So whenever government processes a person's personal data, then we leave kind of a mark, a log, that they can check for what reason the government processed their data and for what reason. And similarly, it is about empowering people as well. So if the government has private data that we hold, then let's give individuals a chance to actually decide over who has access from private sector for universities. And again, we have around 1/5 of Estonians who have donated their genome data to the government. So in many ways, we can decide over how we use that data, but I still truly believe that a person must be in charge of how we use data. We need to be transparent on how we operate. And through taking those risks in consideration, we are actually able to kind of utilize AI in a human-friendly way, adhering to privacy, adhering to other risks and so on.
Great. Well, we are almost out of time, so I'm going to ask very, very quickly, 5 words or less. What is your prediction for public sector innovation in the next decade? Jeanne.
Data-driven partnerships for equitable innovation.
Brilliant. Laura.
I think the future for innovation is bright. The role of government and society in managing that is a big question mark still.
That was more than 5, but I'll let you off. Ott.
I'm just going to make it short. AI powered government.
Oh, well, that's a big thought, isn't it?
That's in our 2030 agenda. So
wow. So I'm going to say #Webit. Get involved in that conversation, most definitely. Well, thank you so much. Really fascinating session on technology innovation in the public sector. I hope it's created some food for thought for those who've been listening, and that the discussion continues off the platform. This has been part of Webit's Global Impact Week. For me, the kind of the real takeaways of this idea about empowerment, the individual versus what we need to do to support that through regulation, whether it's tailored on a local level or is more universal. I think we're going to end up seeing a bit of a mix of both from the conversations that we're having here. And I've just enough time just to say a massive thank you again to our panelists, Jeanne Holm, Chief Data Officer and Deputy Mayor at the City of Los Angeles, to Laura Sallstrom, Professor of Technology Policy at Duke University, and to Ott Velsberg, Chief Data Officer for the Estonian government. And of course, to the Webit team for hosting this session. And a massive thank you to all of you for joining us. And please, keep on innovating.